And we'll get going here. About 7:02, the waiting room is turned off, so if other folks are showing up late, or if you all who are joining us on the call know of other folks that are showing up, or again want to continue sharing this out to people, please don't hesitate.
All right.
Jonathan Stewart. I'm a member of the Shenandoah Group of the Sierra Club Executive Committee, so I'll be facilitating this evening's discussion. On behalf of the Shenandoah Group of the Sierra Club and Climate Action Alliance of the Valley, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for presentation and discussion with Dr. Robert K Musil. A few housekeeping things as we get started. Please keep your mic muted throughout the presentation and hold all questions into the Q&A portion of our event. The chat is open for use, and we'll be sure to address any questions you post there during the Q&A. Dr. Musil is the president and CEO of the Rachel Carson Council, the legacy environmental organization envisioned by Rachel Carson and founded in 1965 by her closest friends and colleagues. Bob speaks widely at colleges and universities, leads RCC campaigns on global climate change and environmental justice, and is a leading advocate on Capitol Hill. From 1992 to 2006, Dr. Musil was the longest-serving executive director and CEO of Physicians for Social Responsibility, the winner of the 1985 Nobel Prize for Peace. He's a graduate of Yale and Northwestern Universities and the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. He's the author of Hope for the Planet, How Americans Are Fighting Global Warming and Building a Better Future, Rachel Carson and Her Sisters, Extraordinary Women Who Have Shaped America's Environment, and Washington in Spring, a nature journal for a changing capital. I'll post links for all those in the chat so you guys can check those out at your leisure as well. Bob also serves as chairman of the board of the Council for a Livable World, chairman of the board of the Population Connection Action Fund, and board member of Beyond Nuclear and the Environment and Energy Studies Institute. Dr. Musil, thank you so much for joining us all here in the Valley. The floor is yours for as long as you need it, and we'll end off with a Q&A.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think I see some old friends here. I'm looking at April Moore. Did we not know each other in a previous life? No, I knew an April Moore. Anyhow, before we get going too wild here, I wanted to thank you. This event, very broadly speaking, came about because I was scheduled to speak at JMU at James Madison for Earth Week, and then this COVID-19 thing came along. I'm still actually scheduled to appear there in the spring, but I don't think that's going to happen either. So I'm getting used to meeting people in your homes and getting to see your dogs and your guitars and your furniture and all those things. But I am seriously very, very pleased to be with you, with the Sierra Club, the Shenandoah Group, and with the Climate Action Alliance of the Valley. That's because I don't have to take all my time, in which the title for the talk, and we'll get close to that, is Action and Elections in Virginia. What would Rachel Carson do? So Jonathan very nicely said that I speak at colleges. Now I speak in my living room. But when I was live, I could look out and see the audience of mostly undergraduates, and many of whom had been told to attend my lecture for extra credit or to write a paper, and they're sort of like this. And I say, so how many of you know who Rachel Carson is? And you can see people texting each other and sort of going, oh, you know. And then every once in a while, a very bright undergraduate in the back row would say, oh, I know, my parents told me all about Carson. Yes. He was the late night talk show host who wore a big turban, Karnak the Magnificent. Oh, that's very nice. No, that's not. And then another bright undergraduate in the back row was, oh, no. I know. My parents did talk about Carson. He's the butler from Downton Abbey. After I would go through a few, I know it's terrible, but the truth is, I won't have to explain who Rachel Carson is and Silent Spring and pesticides and the growth of the environmental movement. But I do think I will need to clear up a few myths that still adhere to Rachel Carson. Because when she wrote Silent Spring, an immediate bestseller, grabbed incredible attention around the country. In fact, some of you, I see a couple of people may remember that when she wrote Silent Spring, the president was a young fellow named John F. Kennedy. And he was at a press conference, and a reporter says, as they do now, and well, no, not now, but normally reporters would ask real questions and get real answers. And they'd say, Mr. President, we're hearing a lot about pesticides. Are you going to be doing anything about that? And he says, why, yes, you must be talking about Miss Carson's book, Silent Spring, where we're going to be forming a task force and looking into the pesticide question. Can you imagine? Things didn't go viral then. They went around the country in books and magazines and television with everyone watching. I only wish that Donald Trump would say about my books, terrible books, all lies, no facts. And I could have as many sales as Rachel Carson did. But the effect of writing Silent Spring and testifying in the Congress, where Senator Ribicoff and others said to her, so you're the little lady that started it all, quoting Abe Lincoln to Harriet Beecher Stowe about the Civil War, that this myth grew up around Rachel, that she alone, this one woman with one book, lit a fire that set the environment movement aflame and brought us all the changes that we knew until they were undone by later presidents. Well, I want to tell you that Rachel Carson, a couple of things we don't know, she did not act alone. It was not just one book that set off the environmental movement. And there's another myth that adheres to Rachel, because she was diffident, somewhat shy. She wasn't a big talker like your speaker tonight. People have this idea that you're sort of a recluse, or that she was not, and that she was not terribly political. She wrote a book. That's what did it. So I want to try to clear up those myths about Rachel Carson before we talk about what that means for today in Virginia. That Rachel was deeply political, deeply involved in the movement. It was sometimes called the conservation movement in those days, not yet quite the environmental movement. She worked with every well-known organization at the time, the Sierra Club being one of the main ones. She left some of her estate to the Sierra Club. She was very attuned to Defenders of Wildlife, the Audubon Society, and I could go on and on and on, as well as local groups that she worked with in Maryland, in Maine, that she also had a network, a social network. There was no email or Instagram or whatever, of scientists and activists around the country who fed her information as part of this movement that was growing up and that was there, was already concerned about pesticides. They had already brought lawsuits. Who became Rachel's good friend on Long Island, Marjorie Spock, and with undergraduate audience, I always say, that Mr. Spock? Have you ever heard of Dr. Spock? It's Dr. Spock's sister, Marjorie Spock, an incredible activist who brought suit against DDT spraying on Long Island, was part of a group called the Committee Against Mass Poisoning, and sent Rachel all the materials from all of the movement. And so Rachel was not alone. She was not just a great author or environmental writer who set off the movement. She was part of the movement. She was taking action already. Also quite political. People like to say, and I won't bore you with scholarly arguments over was Rachel Carson political or not political. Let us be clear. I'll quote Bernie Sanders. Let me be clear. Rachel Carson was political. Okay? That is Her preferred candidate in 1956 won Adlai Stevenson. She was for him because he was against open-air nuclear testing. He had a better environmental program than the Eisenhower administration. She worked and campaigned and voted for Adlai Stevenson. At the same time, she spoke out against the Eisenhower administration. I'm being bipartisan and fair here, because Ike came in and replaced all of the heads of the conservation organizations, agencies in the government at the time. I wish you could read a piece by Rachel Carson called Mr. Day's Dismissal. The head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where she worked, was a guy named Albert Day. He was replaced, and a friend of industry, business, and against the environment was put in by Dwight Eisenhower, and they began to roll back any of the environmental gains that have been made from Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, up until Rachel's time. So you can bet she was fairly political. I want you to know, too, that she worked directly for and with John F. Kennedy. When he said, "Oh, you must be referring to Miss Gosson," she was with Women for JFK. She campaigned. She was on the task forces that he's talking about. She worked extremely closely with his Secretary of Interior, one Stuart Udall, and his Chief of Staff, wrote speeches, wrote legislation, was deeply involved in creating the momentum within the government and without that was going to lead to the EPA, to the Clean Water Act, and all of the things that came after she unfortunately died of metastasizing breast cancer. But in addition to these things, I think I want you to understand why the Rachel Carson Council literally carries on Rachel's work, is the heir to what she believed. We carry on her environmental ethic. It's in our website, www.rachelcarsoncouncil.org. Go there before the show ends. And it talks about peace and justice and sustainability, all linked together, because that is the way Rachel Carson saw these issues. And her ethic combined impeccable real science. She would have finished a PhD in biology at Johns Hopkins, but she was a Depression-era child. Her fellowship wasn't good enough. She took care of her extended family, her mother, her nephews, the whole family. And so she had to stop for lack of money to keep going, and took a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is how she did many of the things that we know about. But this ethic combines impeccable science, real science, not junk science, with imagination and awe and empathy and caring for others. I'm currently editing a new edition of Rachel Carson's first book, Under the Sea Wind. You can't buy it because it's not done, so I won't pitch it to you. But in Under the Sea Wind, the heroes, the main characters of that book, who are anthropomorphized by Rachel Carson, we enter into their lives, are Scomber, the mackerel, and Anguilla, the eel. We flee the trawlers and the fish nets. We see their predators. We follow them as they go and migrate and reproduce. We are them. And that ability, imaginatively, to enter in and care about something that's unusual as a mackerel or an eel, is the central thing that sets Rachel Carson apart. We are all part of the same evolution, the same development of species throughout the eons. We are all connected, and there is no other. If you can love a mackerel and an eel and become them, then the switch to other people, distant people, different than you, racially, ethnically, in other countries, is a simple one. And that is what, for us, for me, talks centrally about Rachel Carson's work and how it ties up for what we all do. The passion and the caring and the imagining of what life could be like, and what other people and other animals and other species' lives are like. We're talking about justice also. Did Rachel Carson care about justice, environmental justice? The Rachel Carson Council works on environmental justice, climate justice. That briefly is because Rachel Carson actually not only cared about others, but had a sense of environmental justice. A quick example, I mentioned Silent Spring, in which her ability to describe and feel led people to care about dying robins in that book. Many people forget that it's linked to human health and environmental health. And in there, you will find Rachel Carson, never went there, never saw them, writing about California farm workers who are getting sprayed and exposed at high levels to the pesticides and herbicides that she wrote about, with a concern for people she's never even seen or met. Similarly, Rachel was anti-nuclear, like the Sierra Club. She wrote in a new introduction to The Sea Around Us against open-air nuclear testing, dumping of nuclear waste and submarines into the sea, because it goes up through the food chain, it bioaccumulates, and she talks about how it harms Eskimo mothers. We're now called, there are Inuit mothers. Children are harmed. No fault of their own. They did not carry out open-air nuclear testing like the Americans and the Russians that led to the harm coming far off in the Arctic Circle. Rachel never went. The Inuit mothers never set off nuclear weapons, but she writes movingly about how unfair that is, caring about those other people. I also want you to know quickly just about justice, that Rachel, she's older than I am. She's not with us directly anymore. But she went to Johns Hopkins in the beginning of the Depression in the late 1920s. I need you to know that American science, mainstream American scientists, believed in eugenics. Again, with undergraduates, I do my Ferris Bueller's Day Off bit. It's funny, it's almost a 30-year-old movie, but still people know about it. Anyone, what is eugenics? Bueller? And they all go like, I don't know. So I explain it is to improve the genes of people and the race, the white race, the superior race, not only to get rid of other races, but defective people, people who have mental problems and are considered substandard. Well, Rachel worked for two world-class biologists at Hopkins. She was their half-time assistant. One of them, named Raymond Pearl, was for eugenics and became the first globally known, recognized biologist to say, I have been studying genetics and genes and races. This is junk. Eugenics is racism. And quit and join the NAACP. That was when Rachel was young. When she was working on Silent Spring, her literary agent, Marie Rodell, was the literary agent who brought to us, helped create, publicize, and publish the first book from a then little-known Baptist preacher from down south, a book called Stride Toward Freedom, 1957, Martin Luther King, Jr. Marie Rodell was Rachel's close friend and advisor. Rachel lived and worked in a milieu in which justice mattered. And so when we moved to the Rachel Carson Council, and today and working in Virginia and with all of you, I can say that when I first came to the Rachel Carson Council, the very first thing we did was look at areas that Rachel cared about, that I had worked on, and I could pull together projects and teams and people who would care. North Carolina is one of those places. And so we did a study about hog farms, factory farms. Rachel Carson wrote a scathing introduction to a book, the first expose of factory farms in this country, in 1964, just before she died. Animal machines. She talked about greed and efficiency and computers and how the animals and the consumers, when they pump these poor animals full of antibiotics and growth hormones, how horrible it is. So when we moved to North Carolina in our time, when the Chinese holding group, the WH company, bought Smithfield Foods, which for $6 billion and all the factory farms in eastern North Carolina, and we did reports, you can see them on the website, one called Pork and Pollution. Get to the point here that it shows you, if I were facile at putting up things on the screen and all that, I worked with a friend of mine, an epidemiologist from the University of North Carolina School of Public Health, and his graduate students and our staff. When we put together this report, you can see a map of North Carolina with counties in black, which have on it little red dots like measles that are the CAFOs, the factory farms of the hogs. They are concentrated in two counties in North Carolina, Duplin County and Sampson County, eastern North Carolina. Those are the deepest areas of slavery in North Carolina at that time, and of Jim Crow, and of segregation, and of voter suppression, and of the very things that we're concerned about right now. The same thing is true. We did this on chickens in Maryland, two counties over in Eastern Shore, Maryland, predominantly African American, is where all the chicken crap and all of the stuff that comes out of there. Those are the places that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were slaves. Same thing goes on today. So as we built our work, these issues begin to connect. We have worked both in North Carolina, and we began to move toward Virginia because they kept wanting to put pipelines through Virginia to go to North Carolina, from West Virginia through Virginia. As you know, all of us together can celebrate having beaten back the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, but that's not the case yet for the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And those are the kinds of things that, as you are all working together in Virginia, need to focus on. I'm proud to say that the Rachel Carson Council has a series of fellows. We pay a little bit, they compete, they become fellows. We had 3 of them working in Virginia, one of whom, Rachel Carson Council fellow, Michael James DeRamo, wrote brilliantly. You can still see his flaming, wonderful prose, but also what he's writing about as how he went up into and camped out in the trees they were trying to cut down, and then he chained himself to the bulldozers that were going to do the same thing. I'm one of these mild-mannered, inside the beltway lobbyist types. I mean, I've done lots of grassroots, but I don't chain myself to bulldozers. And when I saw and talked and worked and understood how deeply this affected Michael, who grew up in those hills, and why he was so angry and what hadn't been done. He said, Bob, I've done all that. I've lobbied, I've worked, I've gone to Richmond, I've done it all, damn it, I gotta do more. And so we began in our work to discover that the pipelines are linked to natural gas facilities, that they run through, as you know, predominantly poor African-American, poor whites, but generally, as I like to say to people, I live in Bethesda, Maryland, a nice suburb. We don't have pipelines, hog farms. We don't have any of that stuff. We send it elsewhere. And so we, I think, need to focus on the kinds of actions that you all have been doing. I said I was glad to be talking and working with you because Rachel Carson cared deeply about Virginia. I'll just say that she wrote a booklet about Chincoteague, one of her favorite vacations and birding. You know, she was a birder and a naturalist, and she went to Cobb Island, one of the barrier islands off the bottom from me, below Maryland, off of Virginia. It's often mostly underwater these days thanks to climate change and sea level rise. Rachel knew about climate change. She was friends with Roger Revelle, who taught it Al Gore at Harvard. They presented materials to the Kennedy administration about climate change. Rachel was writing about suspecting what was going on in the sea around us. She didn't live long enough for when all of these materials went to the Kennedy administration and they began to speak out, believe it or not, long ago. So we link these things together. Pipelines, natural gas, climate change, flooding, hurricanes, and most recently, we've been very concerned about a little known thing called the production of wood pellets. Because Rachel Carson also cared about forests and woodlands. She tried to save a place up in Maine called the Lost Woods along the coast. And we have a project called Lost Woods that would allow you to see what is going on, in which the Enviva Corporation comes in and clear cuts, and then takes the wood products and turns them into industrial scale chips sent to Europe, burned in former coal-fired utilities to get credit under the Paris Agreement through a loophole there. And in what some of my staff and interns and fellows did was put together a mapping project called Lost Woods that will allow you to see. I haven't been there because we're all stuck virtually, but I saw that there was, I have to look at it because I don't live next to it. In St. Paul, it is the Virginia City Hybrid Energy, 120 megawatts, burning wood pellets. There's another project down in Southampton County in Franklin, Virginia, that chops up and produces 545,000 tons of wood pellets. Your woods, North Carolina woods, throughout the Southeast, both destroying the woods, species, then creating climate change through burning this stuff up. And in every case, you can go take a look at the demographics of who lives there, what their income is, what their educational levels are. It's not Bethesda. And so I think that our actions, what you have been doing, make a critical difference. They call things to people's attention. It means that as we head into this critical election in Virginia, we need to keep up that pressure. The actions that Sierra Club and CAAV do and others, because that's what gets the attention to these issues. I work, and the Rachel Carson Council works happily on the Green New Deal. I am not buddies, I wish I were, with AOC, but I am with one Senator Ed Markey, who goes back to the nuclear freeze, for those of you who are almost as senior as I am. And, excuse me, those climate efforts linked to the economy and justice and poor people come out of the kinds of actions and pressures that we all and you all have been doing. Now that we get to the election, however, because I speak on many campuses, I worry. I want to make sure that people participate. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's very clear that there are two candidates, two tickets. One is for the environment and climate and justice. The other is not. It's called Biden, Harris, and Trump, Pence. I will be there if we manage to get a new administration with Biden and Harris. Talking to Kamala Harris, who I know for lots of reasons, and Joe Biden, who I go way back with. But might we be disappointed, as we sometimes were with President Obama? I think we now know we don't get many better presidents than Barack Obama. Was he perfect on the environment? Are those corporations still out there? Are those vested interests that Rachel Carson wrote about still there? Yes. There are reasons that Joe Biden is a little weak on fracking. He's trying to win Pennsylvania. I have worked endlessly in Pennsylvania, and with groups like yours. If we get everyone to turn out and vote, Biden, Harris, and none of these people are perfect, Mark Warner, and on down through the line, though I do want to put a plug in, if I can, for Dr. Cameron Webb. Your congressional district, I believe, is currently hopeless in terms of the environment and justice. One Ben Klein, who won with nearly 60% of the vote, but I was chatting with Jonathan earlier. I've lived in districts like that. I've seen them change over time. But in the meantime, we have a very, very tight race for Cameron Webb, who I met with and talked for about an hour yesterday. Will be very good. Will he be perfect in the 5th district? That's the one that Leslie Coburn ran in before. It goes from Charlottesville all the way down through Virginia. You all know that in this day and age, we can work, get our friends virtually, send money, tell our friends who live there, in lots of ways to participate in it. And so I want to make sure that nobody stays home. No one says, Joe Biden's not good enough. I was for Bernie. I was for Elizabeth. I was for Kamala when she was, whatever. No. No more throwaway votes. But then I want to tell you, and I want to talk with you about how Rachel Carson and the Rachel Carson Council, she wanted formed as she was dying of breast cancer. I want a group to carry on my work. This is it. This is what we do. This is why we care both about action and grassroots. We care about Virginia as much as you do, as Rachel Carson did. And we want to elect people as she would have. Adlai Stevenson was not perfect. John F. Kennedy certainly was not perfect. Joe Biden won't be perfect. And that's where our job finally comes in. The action does not stop unless there is pressure from the outside. And a few mellow people like me, I actually put on, well, if we ever get to go visit people, literally, I put on my coat and tie. I will go to the White House. I'll go to the Vice President's mansion. And I'll go see Chuck Schumer and the senators whom I know and say, you know, you're not doing enough. Cory Booker, I love, is for nuclear stuff. You know, I've had long conversations, but they're complex reasons. The biomass and the pellets that I've been talking about. A lot of Democrats see this as a bridge kind of thing that will get us to the low or no carbon future. So I'll be chatting nicely with them saying, well, I'm afraid it's not good enough. While you all can be raising hell in the valley and trying to change it politically and keep the work that you've been doing going. Because Rachel Carson, finally, I have to say, said in one of her speeches, conservation is a cause that has no end. We will need to carry on her legacy. She was close friends with David Brower when he was too radical for the Sierra Club back in the day. We need to carry on those legacies now. That's why I am very, very proud to be with you virtually in the Valley, to work alongside of you, and to find out what you are doing, what more we can do, and how we can help. So thank you for having me into your living rooms, and let's see if we can talk some.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We did have one question that just popped up in the chat. So it's from Kathy Strickler. She says, Bob, was Rachel Carson ever jailed? Also, can you talk a little bit about Sandra Steingraber, her sacrifices in jail time, and her messages to us now?
No, yes. No, Rachel Carson was never jailed. She, when she became, famous, was John F. Kennedy administration, and she had access to the White House. She lived in Washington, and so her role was much more primarily working with the administration. You also have to understand that Rachel was sick a lot, not just breast cancer toward the end of her. She had many, many family responsibilities, didn't travel much, but no, to my knowledge, she did not commit civil disobedience, was not arrested. Unlike my friend and colleague, Sandra Steingraber, who I have to say, here's a plug. I wrote a book called Rachel Carson and Her Sisters, Extraordinary Women Who Shaped America's Environment. You can get it from your local independent bookstore online, or if you must, from one of those big multinational things that sells books. Robert K Musil, if you just Google Robert Musil, you'll get an Austrian novelist who was not my great-grandfather. I've been working on it. So in that book is Sandra Steingraber. I actually helped set up her first bookstore for her first book when she came to Washington long, long ago, living downstream, then called The Cancer Survivor Looks at Ecology and the Environment. So for those of you who may not know Sandra Steingraber, lives upstate New York in Ithaca. She's also a distinguished adjunct at Ithaca College, and led the opposition to fracking in New York, arrested many, many times, has also come down to DC with Bill McKibben and others from the way we built some of the momentum around climate. Was, you may recall, there were 2,000 people well known who got arrested. Then there were 12,000 who circled the White House, and then it got to larger demonstrations, finally 400,000 people in New York during a UN session. So Sandra was involved in all of that. She is one who is literally in the tradition of Rachel Carson, has written about that, has talked about how her father, before he had a terrible a disease related to that. But Sandra had her own case of cancer and marched with women in the early breast cancer days where they waved copies of Silent Spring and said Rachel Carson was right, or had signs about that because of the connections between exposures to toxic chemicals. So let's see. We have a 2-hour-long video buried in my website where Sandra was the keynote speaker at a conference I put on for the Rachel Carson Council in 2016. We had senators and Senator Whitehouse, and we had people up from North Carolina talking about racial justice and hogs. Sandra's talked about how we have to get arrested or we will end up regretting what the Trump administration will do. And powerful speaker in a deep kind of way. She doesn't flail around. She's just dead on. And I had my own members say, well, I'm going to go get arrested. I said, well, make sure you make a donation before you do that. No, so that's Sandra. I don't, Kathy, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but thank God we have Sandra and people like her, women who have carried on these traditions, from Rachel and women before her, and folks like David Brower who were at Sierra Club. Oh.
I have a question for you, Bob. So people are generally resistant to change. It always strikes me as curious that something like climate change isn't that more alarming to folks. So in your leadership roles, your various chairmanships and your role with Rachel Carson Council, how have you experienced resistance to change when you're in that leadership capacity? And can you speak a little bit to how we can be better change makers and leaders within our own communities and families?
Wow, that is a good one. Because I've done a lot of lobbying, I hasten to say it's citizen lobbying. I am not ExxonMobil. But we sort of have to think about those people who are allies and friends and share our strategies. Ed Markey's a perfect example. Senator Whitehouse or Elizabeth Warren. Plot strategy. We figure out how to use them on the inside, us on the outside. So they're our friends. Then there are people who, frankly, are beyond hope. If you're lobbying, we divide them up 1 through 5. You don't go see the 4s and 5s. You don't have enough time in this world. You try to focus on those who show any signs of being open, not so much listening, but having some self-interest that you share with them. But the resistance to change, I think, comes well, with those in power, it goes straight to their self-interest, their money, their contributions, big money, corporations, etc. With the public, I, for a long time, have talked about climate justice in terms of human beings. You are aware, of course, that climate change used to, and still to some degree, is talked about in terms of CO2 concentrations and science and melting ice caps and polar bears, and that's not what people care about. They care about their kids, they care about their jobs, where they live, etc. And so an environmental health or an environmental justice perspective where we talk about asthma as a perfect example. I was with Physicians for Social Responsibility. We did lots about that, still do with the Rachel Carson Council. So that, I'll give you a quick example. I remember I was in Maine when I could travel. There was a guy who, a friend of mine introduced in hopes that this person might be a high donor. Yeah, I raised money, I'm sorry. So it turns out their sons played soccer together on a team. I could tell, I'm looking at these guys, I'm talking with him, he doesn't seem all that interested. I feel like he's gonna write, forgive me, this is a very wealthy, like write me a check for $1,000 and go home. So as we're talking about this, I discover that his son has asthma. And I start talking about what we're doing about asthma and how we know about the various rates and what kinds of things are happening. And I swear, you can do something about that. Air quality and the monitoring and what happens in emergency rooms. And it was a whole new, because he cared deeply about his son and asthma and his family's well-being. Of course, he cared about other stuff. I think with undergraduates, and I see a lot of them, I get to talk to people who don't agree with me. And I try to find those areas in their personal lives that they care about. And so I have many, many approaches to climate change and climate justice. And that would mean, let's say somebody's into hunting and fishing. I don't hunt and I don't fish. I've shot guns, but I begin to talk about that and why they love it and why they're so involved with it. And before long, you know, they start talking about how the woods aren't what they used to be and they're building something down the road. And so I'm sorry, it's a great question that I'm not doing the best answer to, but I think, and nowadays, with the miracles of all this electronic stuff, in campaigns, people began to segment their approaches. That may sound like they're pandering, but the truth is, people care about different things in Miami, in Cuban American Florida, than they do in Bethesda or they do in the Valley. And if you really care, you'll begin to understand and address those issues, those perspectives. I can tell you lots of stories where I've had odd allies that I've worked with, who I never thought I would, who had one little overlap. It wasn't the whole Green New Deal economic justice piece at once. It was a little piece. And that's where you start. Yeah, it is a puzzle. But I think involving people, and that's why I try to talk about Rachel Carson, writing about people in Silent Spring. It's not just about robins and fish and all that sort of thing. And that's why I think you all agree.
Oh, great. That was a wonderful answer. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and open it up if folks have other questions. We do have some questions that came in through the registration process, but I want to make sure that folks have an opportunity. Go ahead and unmute yourselves if you'd like and ask, or if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can feel free to put other things in chat.
This is where I usually start singing if they don't get questions.
Can I ask
Essa.
a question? Yeah.
Yes, hi Essa. I'm Bob. Good to see you.
Great. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on and
Yeah,
hosting.
all this way. Yeah.
As I listen to you speak, I'm interested in becoming more involved. It's always been a priority for me, the environment, but I have to say that I feel very powerless. And when I hear you speak, I mean, you're talking about somebody who's going to write you $1,000 check like it's no big deal. And you're talking about all the lobbying you do with all these big wigs in politics and whatnot. And I can't help but feeling like my letters that I write to Ben Klein, who's not really going to be listening to me anyway, is it worthwhile? Or how can I make me being, you know, I don't have the clout, I don't have the prestige that you have. How can I keep sort of motivated and thinking that this is worthwhile?
Well, not everything has to be political. You know, I was going to talk about actions and elections, etc. I don't know enough about local elections in your area, state representatives or city councils or school boards, whatever. Sometimes there are things there that are more reasonable and less distant. But I think in terms of feeling powerless, and I'll just give you a pitch for the organization or the Sierra Club or any of them. If you join it along with the Sierra Club, you know, we all count our members and activists differently, but they seriously have 1.5 million at least, or whatever, people all over the place. You're just one little person. When they send you an alert and say, we want you to click on and do X, it has a huge impact. You just have to believe me. I mean, how else in the world Well, we've changed the House of Representatives. We've passed 150 bills that include climate justice and clean energy, all sorts of things that come from those simple. So one of the first things I think is if you're involved with an organization, you can feel like you're part of something. I speak, because I'm not world famous, I wish I were, I speak at a lot of colleges and universities, also other places, but they're not the best known, most famous colleges, often in conservative areas. And the students, the environmental club comes out, and there are 8 of them meet me in the cafeteria. No one here cares. They don't care. Well, if you join with us, there's just a quick 10,000 faculty and students around the country that you're just you, and so that's one way. But operating in your everyday life, I've got 2 daughters who are professionals. They're home. The school is not working. I mean, they're on endless Zoom calls. The kids can't go outside. They're in California because of the fires. I mean, it's just horrible. So amidst all that she's doing, the one daughter, just as an example, is trying to change and improve things in the local little old school. I mean, she does international stuff as well, but and that is the kind of place where sooner or later, if we're going to have teachers, curriculum, things that talk about caring for others or justice or nature or new kinds of things, that works. You can also these days virtually volunteer. I have interns and fellows all over the country. It's one of the few sort of benefits we invented, frankly, because we can't go around anymore the way we used to. So again, your voice matters when linked with others at very personal levels. I would take on the relatives too. We all have, well, I say we all, I don't want to generalize too much. I have relatives who range from the fairly far left to a few Trump supporters. And then there are those, I don't know where the middle is, but I know one voted for an independent with the first Trump election. It's really a vote for Trump, but this particular person is not hardcore. And so she's interested in birds and nature. I've been sending her stuff and she's learning more and more and more. I don't jump on her and say, "You idiot." if you're not for Bernie, you're bad. And we don't have Thanksgiving dinner right now, but I'm the guy who likes to sound out those folks and their concerns. Again, as I was talking about lobbying, if you have crazy old Uncle Ralph who's a member of the Klan, forget about it. Just let him be. But others, that would care and love, they have worries that the government is too big, that it'll, without repeating it all. So you hear, again, it's like Jonathan was saying, how do you create a message? How do you talk to people about this stuff? So that's another thing you can do. I'm doing it. I think I've made some progress with this one relative. This will give you an idea. Has houses in Ohio and Florida. Yep. But she used to be an anti-nuclear activist way back. Well, there have been these deals in Ohio with straight bribery to keep these ailing, leaking, crappy plants that she fought 40 years ago afloat. Suddenly she's like, "Yeah, that's outrageous. I didn't know that. I didn't know that the legislature did that." Because if her husband only listens to Fox News, you got a problem. So your personal, and because these things connect, when you start talking about new people in a state legislature here or a school board here, it's getting in touch with people, and you have some agency. You have a voice. You have point of view. You just don't want to beat them on the head. It doesn't work. Never has. But thank you. I wish we could actually, talk, and we could keep going on this. So.
I think we formally have time for one more question. We want to respect people's times. If people have to jump off at 8 o'clock, you can go ahead and do that. I suspect if folks are willing and wanting to talk more, then we'll just keep the Zoom call up and we'll keep on keeping on. But does anyone else have any other questions right now?
While you're thinking, I can tell you, I literally was with Bill Clinton in the White House, where the aides are there. People had watches. Oh no, it's real interesting. Bob wants to talk about malaria, and Hillary cares about malaria and climate change, and bring in some pizza. Anyhow, I'm ready. So
we were wondering, I was wondering.
Hi.
This is Charlie Strickler.
Oh, hi, Charlie.
I have a sister who's a very nice person.
Mine too.
And she has lots of children and grandchildren. She even adopted a dark-skinned daughter. Her big issue and only issue is abortion. How can you talk to her about what needs to be done to protect her children and grandchildren that now exist without alienating her over the abortion issue?
Yeah. You probably didn't catch it. Jonathan mentioned in my introduction that I am the chairman of the board of the Population Connection Action Fund. Their PAC, that's the former Zero Population Growth, that deals in women's reproductive health, family planning, and abortion. Now, that is probably one of the toughest of all. Depending on the issue, I will talk about politicians I admire. Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, senator, is one. He cares deeply because his particular version, there are Roman Catholics, there are evangelicals, there's a mix of people who are pro-life, as they call it. But it may not be possible, but I try to talk about how we have a whole set of other interests that will take abortion. I am not a Roman Catholic. I can quote Laudato Si and Pope Francis verbatim, talking about justice and poor people and climate change, and why that all matters. I sometimes talk about people on the Catholic left that I know who are so consistent in their pro-life views that they are opposed to war, capital punishment. Most pro-life people I've met don't seem to have a problem with war and bombing and whatever, executions. But I don't have a good answer for that. It's very, very difficult, other than if I had a personal conversation. I sometimes talk about my own faith. I am one of these weird people called a progressive Christian. I don't have time to even define that. People say to me, do you believe in the resurrection? I'll say, well, what do you mean by resurrection? Or something powerful went on that we weren't there, you weren't there. We have these sacred texts and documents and histories, but what I do know is I follow somebody who cares about loving others and caring about the little children and all of that. And I try to say why my particular church is pro-choice, why they believe deeply that is, but Charlie, that is you win the prize for the impossible question of the evening. But I think it really gets down to trying to walk in the shoes of, understand. I mentioned earlier that Rachel Carson had us caring deeply about a mackerel and an eel in her first book. And I don't mean to compare any of your relatives to mackerels and eels. We have to remember that they are deeply steeped in their own feelings and beliefs, and they have their own fears and reasons for this. And so I try to hear that. But it is not unusual to come to a place where we just can't agree. Point I'll say, well, we can't agree. I do try to point out some of the other evils that whether Christians, Jews, Muslims shouldn't like, that will happen if you vote one way or another. No doubt about it. But so I wish you well.
Any other questions? Again, we can, if we're officially at our time that we said we would have folks at. So, but Dr. Musil, if you're fine to stick around for a couple other questions, then we'll.
I am. I also won't be insulted if the screens start to go beep, boop, and disappear. But I will say I said at the beginning, and I like being. I don't feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I feel like I am with people that we share this incredibly deep, important commitment, and that we can work together even while we're apart and virtually, and how important it is in this election, and as important after the election. And so whether you have questions still now, or we connect up, if I get to come to JMU live one of these days, I don't know. But I do hope you will sign. There's a little link to sign up for our newsletters and alerts and resources and action alerts. And I hate to say it, we don't ask for money enough. I mean, mostly get information. So, but I would love to have you involved, and you will hear much more about what the Rachel Carson Council does, what we do in coalition with other groups, what is happening that I think might give ESSA or others some sense that they're not alone. Just like Rachel Carson was not alone. She often was alone, writing, not feeling well. But she was part of a very broad movement of people who cared. She happened to write a book, and she was a famous writer that launched her. But everybody else made that possible. And I can say that it's really Sandra Steingraber, Kathy, who said that a lot of the actions and civil disobedience and so on that went on made things like Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and more lately, that creates an opening for those of us like me who are more given to wearing a tie around the marble halls of Congress, though I do go out and about. So we're in this together. I look forward to seeing you again, either virtually or live. I really thank you for all you are doing, and even just tuning in. You know, this is taking time away from families, from my cat who's meowing over there. It makes an incredible difference, and so I thank you for that. And I'll be happy to say goodnight to those of you who want to click off. If anyone wants to stay for the pizza and my aides going like, you know, get cut, we're open to that too. So thank you all very much for what you're doing.